Oh, how I love James Bond. There have been so many incredible films these past 60 years, such a variety of adventures, a veritable secret government cache hidden in a Cuban textile of masterpieces. Dr. No, From Russia with Love, Honor Majesty's Secret Service, The Spy Who Loved Me, The Living Daylights, and License to Kill, GoldenEye, Die Another Day, Casino Royale, Quantum of Solace, No Time to Die Another Day? Those of you whose heads didn't explode like they got depressurized when they heard that must think there's some kind of mistake. But no, guys, I'm here to tell you that Die Another Day is a masterpiece, with just one teensy tiny caveat, which is that it isn't a masterpiece. I can't even bullshit myself on that. It's not a masterpiece in any shape or form. Are you kidding me? It's the one where Bond surfs on a tsunami. It's the one where Halle Berry says, "Yo mama." It's the one with Madonna. This is a bad movie. But it's not an uninteresting movie. Sure, I could just rip Die Another Day apart, and there are plenty of channels who have gone on to do that. It kinda deserves it in a way. But then, what would I really be adding to the table here? Plenty of Bond fanatics before me have already done that, and it sits pretty firmly as the aggregate pick for the worst film in the entire franchise. And if not at the bottom, I mean, it's pretty close to the bottom, even if Diamonds Are Forever would like a word with all the people who think that this is the worst. No, I'd rather look inside the machine that is Pierce Brosnan's send-off as James Bond, the ending, in a way, to an era of Bond films. I want to interrogate what Lee Tamahori was going for, and which pieces malfunctioned between his vision and the final product. Like any Bond film, except Casino Royale. I mean, that movie's fucking flawless. Die Another Day has ups and downs, and yeah, maybe there are a lot more downs, but I think that there is more to dive into below the surface. I think there are some things the film does that work really well, and most of all, I respect the film that Lee Tamahori was trying to make, the film that Die Another Day could have been. And you know what else I respect? A good night's sleep. Even Gustav Graves, who publicly claims to never sleep, still finds himself catching some Z's in his private little bedchamber. Shame about that bulky, overly complicated sleep mask he uses, though. The good news is Manta Sleep makes the best sleep masks and functional sleep accessories. They're comfortable, deceptively simple sleep masks that also utilize cutting-edge technology to improve and optimize your sleep. With their line of products, Manta Sleep is also taking a stand against the hustle culture perpetrated by the Gustav Graveses of the world with the pro-nap movement. Your body is wired to nap, and naps give you the energy and clarity you don't get if you just grind through the afternoon. Whether you're going with their standard sleep mask or one of their more intricate models, for example, their Cool Mask, which soothes the eyes and sinuses with evenly distributed cooling, their Steam Mask, which is powered by natural steam and provides relief in only 3 to 5 minutes, or their Aroma Mask, which calms and relaxes with 100% pure AAA grade lavender and a scent profile that lasts 15 to 30 times longer than other scented sleep masks. All of Manta Sleep's products boast designs which provide near or even 100% blackout for total relaxation and are all infinitely adjustable so that you can configure them to your perfect fit. So check out their website at mantasleep.com to learn more about your sleep personality and the pro-nap movement. And when you find the perfect sleep mask for you, use code FilmSpeak for 10% off your purchase. That's mantasleep.com and use code FilmSpeak for 10% off your purchase. And thank you so much to Manta Sleep for sponsoring this video. Director Lee Tamahori has been candid about his taste in spy films. He loved The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, The Ipcris Files, these much more downbeat, serious spy films that aren't quite an uproarious celebration of the genre. When you become aware of this, you can sort of see Die Another Day attempting to follow the same threads in its first act, albeit with an added dose of spectacle. That in and of itself might be the entire source of the disconnect here. Die Another Day marked 2 milestones, the 40th anniversary of the film franchise and its 20th entry. The films Tamahori named as favorites were more grounded espionage thrillers, more dour, and Tamahori had the bad luck of endeavoring to create such a thing with a film that would almost certainly have a fan expectation of being, and indeed would end up being marketed as, an uproarious celebration of James Bond. Now, that's not to say Tamahori wasn't playing ball or unwilling to have fun with James Bond. The Ice Palace was as much his decision as Bond being held prisoner for a year was. I think the issue isn't that he was at odds with the franchise, the issue is that he was trying to achieve two things at once: create an ode to the spy films he loved while simultaneously making a fun, action-packed Bond film that appropriately celebrated the franchise's milestone. And yes, he accomplished that. Both halves of what he was going for are clearly present throughout the film, even if the spy who came in from the cold stuff almost entirely exits the film once we get to Iceland. Whether you like his direction or not, whether or not you think he should have picked a lane and stayed there, it's exactly the film Lee Tamahori wanted to make, which also says a lot about producers Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson. Once they pick a filmmaker, they back them 100%, even if the end product isn't great. The quality of the films throughout the series has fluctuated because they trust their filmmakers. It's not about exerting control, it's about creatively working with those filmmakers to best realize their vision. Tamahori was even allowed to come in and do rewrites of Neil Purvis and Robert Wade's original drafts because he had the vision he had for his Bond film. And what you ultimately get is this sort of revival shot of the late 80s, early 90s action films of an era that Bond was largely absent from our screens save for License to Kill. Die Another Day is almost like this movie that exists as a makeup for the 6-year absence while also clearly existing as one of, if not the first post-9/11 action film. The Bourne Identity came out earlier in 2002, but because of when the latter's production wrapped, it doesn't really have any of the same kind of commentary or mood as Die Another Day. Maybe on the surface it seems ridiculous to imply that the most outlandish Bond film is a more measured, deliberate commentary on 21st century global politics than something as raw as The Bourne Identity, but when you really look at what each film is saying, Die Another Day is much more entrenched in the state of the world. In some ways, even though the Craig era began as a complete 180 from Die Another Day, a course correction I might add, this Bond film still has a deep influence on what came from the subsequent 5. We'll get into the finer details of this a bit later on, but in short, it's very interesting to see the ways in which Skyfall and No Time to Die in particular share some thematic fabric with Die Another Day, even down to certain scenes in this film having counterparts in those two latter films. That being said, the overall film we got in Die Another Day is certainly not Skyfall, and I'm not claiming that it's a better commentary on the state of the world than The Bourne Identity, but I think it gets some things right, and yeah, but it also gets a lot of things fucking wrong. Ugh. Man, it's much more like a late 80s, early 90s action film in terms of tone. In fact, take Bond out of the equation, and you could probably make this same film with some generic Arnold Schwarzenegger character. It'd be right in line with some of the films he was doing in the early 2000s, like Collateral Damage. The film goes at a crazy breakneck pace that I'm not even sure Quantum of Solace matches despite being 20 minutes shorter and having a pretty brisk pace itself. Everything is turned up to max, and the dialogue is cheesy as hell, but also features a nearly non-stop riff of quips and puns that would make Michael Bay and his revolving door of screenwriters blush. If you look at what else was at the box office around the same time, sure, there's XXX, which also came out in 2002. There's MI2, which was a couple of years earlier, and Die Another Day is firmly, aesthetically at least, definitely in the same camp of everything's radical and extreme, dude, but rather be so self-serious like the films I just mentioned. Die Another Day tips its hand by almost deliberately being, well, stupid. But it's also kind of awesome. I mean, it immediately announces itself via the CGI bullet in the gun barrel as being in line with the VH1 era style of filmmaking and the extreme sports craze of that era. If The World Is Not Enough puts a cap on the 90s Bond, Die Another Day boldly ushers in the 2000s Bond on a visual stylistic level. David Tattersall, the director of photography on Die Another Day, talked about giving Bond a saturated, glossy look, but he also spoke about not wanting to go for what was in at the end of the 90s because he felt that aesthetic at the time was this grungy sensibility with film grain that Tarantino spearheaded and everyone else wanted to emulate it. Tattersall ended up doing the glossy thing that wound up being a staple of that early 2000s era while trying to avoid doing what he thought was hip. Overall though, trends aside, you can tell that a filmmaker with interesting visual sensibilities is behind the camera. Tomorrow Never Dies probably looks richer than Die Another Day. I mean, not even probably, it does look richer than Die Another Day, but I'll still take the latter over the flat pedestrian visuals of The World Is Not Enough, because good God, that movie is the most visually uninteresting and gross movie of the Brosnan era. Just, hey, you like concrete? You like gray? Well, here you go. You got a whole bunch of it. All right, brass tacks. Let's talk about some of the choices Die Another Day gets right, some of the stuff it does really wrong, and why the film ended up the way it did. Short answer, it was made at the start of the 2000s, and Lee Tamahori's ambition exceeds what filmmaking was capable of 20 years ago. The long answer? Well, let's get a big one out of the way immediately. The infamous tsunami surfing. Yeah, it's bad. We know God, why? It's an unforgivable sequence. Bond parasailing through a tidal wave and escaping to safety off of a conveniently placed iceberg ramp is fucking ridiculous. There's no scenario where the idea of this sequence works. But I wonder, would it be quite so ridiculed today if the effects looked better? I think if this scene were done more towards the back end of the decade, the light years advances made in CGI would have rendered the whole thing a lot more palpable. I mean, Brosnan's trying his best to sell it, God love him. With better green screen compositing, you probably could have had him or a stuntman actually doing the moves on screen, and you'd have a much more realistic waterscape surrounding Bond. They made this scene when the technology available just wasn't ready for it yet, short of them literally causing an Arctic tsunami and having an actual parasailer ride the gigantic wave for real. The invisible car, the vanish, that's another example of a concept being introduced to Bond years too soon. The effect mostly works on camera, albeit largely because of the film's primary way of portraying the car's invisibility is to simply, well, shoot the setup without the Aston Martin in frame. But even when the camouflage is failing, and you get those moments of the car flickering in and out of invisibility, the effect works well enough. That one shot of Brosnan opening the door and getting in aside. The bigger issue though is that the tech just feels so wildly ahead of the time the movie was released. Bond films have a tendency to go 5 minutes into the future with their gadgets, but here we are 20 years after Die Another Day was released, and there still isn't something out there even near the same level, despite advancements made by the likes of hyperstealth, biotechnology. Most everything else that is featured in a Bond film has either already existed or saw a real-life application not very long after the respective film came out. But if you can suspend your disbelief enough to accommodate the vanish, fair enough. I think the much more egregious failure of the vanish lies in the way it's used within the story. Bond sneaking up behind guards in the car is just nonsensical. I mean, that takes it straight into lampoon territory. It's still making noise from the engine. It's still making tire tracks. But these two bozos neither hear nor see any of it? Like, come on, man. It's just silly. The unfortunate thing about the vanish or the ridiculous Bond tsunami scene is that these are only very brief moments in an over 2-hour-long film, and yet they are so horrendously bad, so against what the Bond films are, so outlandish, silly, and downright stupid that they take away from the rest of what's going on. And that's not to say the rest of the film is, much better, but those scenes in particular seem to be the things that people gravitate towards when they talk about this film. Oh, it's the one where Bond was tsunami surfing. Oh, it's the one with the invisible Aston Martin. Oh, it's the one with the Ice Palace and all that ridiculous stuff. When the lows of your movie cross over into lampoon territory and just completely do away with the integrity of the franchise, it becomes something that's hard for people to forgive, to get over, to just kind of cast aside as they look at the rest of the movie. I'm not saying this is the right way to watch the film, but it's understandable that people gravitated towards these moments because it is just 10 steps too far. It also didn't help that the Austin Powers movies were coming out at the same time and just basically did everything these movies were doing as they were coming out, so there was already this weird relationship between excess, parody, James Bond, and all that good stuff. That's not all the movie has to offer. Those are just small moments, and I think if you can get past that, if you can just look at the movie as a whole instead of 3 select moments, you'll be able to appreciate it a bit more. Even what's meant to be the Vanish's saving grace, the ice chase, which in its own right is a really amazing showcase of action. Most of all, the borderline iconic moment where Bond uses the ejector seat to launch the car upright is undermined by the excessive speed ramping and hyperactive editing. Now, that's all part of Tamahori's vision. Fair enough. but that particular editing technique is extremely sparse throughout the sections of the film that precede and follow Iceland. Maybe he was going for a different feeling and energy in each different part of the world that Die Another Day visits, but the end result is that the car chase is the centerpiece of this part of the film. It's what everything else in Iceland is building to, and it could have been better in execution. Don't get me wrong, the car itself is still ridiculous, but I think if the practical effects and stunt work on display were allowed to just breathe, it'd be regarded as one of the better Bond chases in the franchise. But you know what? Not every action sequence in this film is a disaster like the tsunami surfing or stylized to death in the editing room like the ice car chase. The hovercraft chase at the beginning, for my money, rivals the White Knight in execution. All of Pierce's pre-title sequences are breathtaking, but this one is probably one of the bigger rushes. It's aided by the fact that they did so much of this for real. All the explosives, the hovercrafts themselves, it's all real. Well, except for the model shot of the hovercraft going over the waterfall, but I can kind of forgive them for not actually sending William Lee off a cliff. I mean, I think we all can, yeah. There are so many moving parts. It's almost like a Mad Max chase through the forests. Oh, and here's my other hot take. The title sequence by Daniel Kleinman is fantastic. It's one of the most creative ways of showcasing Bond's torture, and probably the best way they could have shown it. This way, the film doesn't skip over Bond's time as a prisoner, but it also doesn't pad the runtime with it, which might have been fine if the movie committed to what it was initially doing, we'll get there, but would have been detrimental to the overall film given how goofy and over the top the rest of it is. I think the title sequence and the pre-title sequence both really speak to Brosnan's Bond being the video game Bond. So much of this has an early 2000s video game aesthetic, and you know what? I love the Madonna song, Fight Me. Oh shit, right into the fencing sequence, all right. I love the Madonna song. It fits the early 2000s vibe they were going for. I don't think it fits James Bond, but it fits this particular James Bond movie as a whole. And you know, it's a bop. It's a bop, come on. It's like, it's got a catchy, you know, instrumental and everything in it. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the lyrics aren't great, right? Like Sigmund Freud analyzed this. Just a little. Anyways, the fencing scene isn't just the best scene in Die Another Day, it's a brilliant specimen, completely flawless. It's still one of the best fight sequences in the entire franchise, and I spare no apologies for that take. The sword fight has so much tension, the way it begins as an incredibly civil conversation between two British gentlemen and ends as, well, this is in line with how the best Bond sequences have small beginnings and grow into something of a much larger spectacle. It's beautifully choreographed by Bob Anderson. I also like how Brosnan is doing a lot of his own stunts too, and unlike a lot of Bond action sequences, it doesn't just exist for the sake of inserting a fight scene. On a second viewing and beyond, you're aware that Graves wants revenge for what happened in North Korea. You can see the wheels turning in his head where he can engineer a way to kill Bond while giving himself plausible deniability that it would be anything more than an accident. A spar that got out of hand. Although manslaughter is, still a thing in the UK, right? I mean, maybe not for him. He's one of the wealthy elite, but I digress. Anyway, the reason this fight, beyond just being awesome, is one of the best is that it tells you everything you need to know about Bond and Gustav Graves in a way that very few fights between Bond and a villain do. Graves has the fiery temper and is probably more technically proficient with swords than Bond, but he gets careless in his rage. He starts making mistakes and taking dumb risks for the tiny chance that he might take Bond out. Bond, on the other hand, has an ego of his own, and Graves doesn't get a little bit under his skin. But he's ultimately a professional who is far more interested in his investigation of Graves than getting even. And ultimately, while he might not be as technical with a blade as Graves, Bond, nonetheless, utilizes his physical abilities and his killer instinct to regain an edge in the fight. It's simple, little nuances that I wish more of the other action sequences in Die Another Day had to really add some depth to them. I guess when it comes to the rest of the film, you could say that the place needed redecorating anyway. Like that shitty Moneypenny scene at the end. God, poor Samantha Bond. It just makes the character a horny secretary, and it's worsened by the fact that she isn't really properly in the film until it's happening. Bond doesn't get the standard light flirtation / postscript briefing earlier on with Moneypenny. Why is this scene even necessary? You could cut it out entirely and you wouldn't lose anything. It's totally regressive for the character in service of a lame joke. It also dumps over her arc of the Brosnan era. There is no way in hell the same Moneypenny from GoldenEye and Tomorrow Never Dies would be caught dead, openly lusting over Bond and pleasuring herself at work like that. Lois Maxwell, the original Moneypenny, went on record about how she deliberately avoided making Moneypenny the cliched secretary of the 60s, with the glasses and the ditziness and the wistful sighing after handsome men passed her desk. She wasn't interested in that, and to be fair, I don't think Eon or Bond's audience even particularly cared for it either, which is why Caroline Bliss didn't work. Samantha Bond came in afterwards with a very refreshing take on Moneypenny, with GoldenEye featuring what may well be the character's best scene since On Her Majesty's Secret Service. This is a clear difference in how Bruce Fierstein wrote her versus how Purvis and Wade do. They're the Bond fanboys, and so write the character in this fanfiction sort of way. Ultimately, Die Another Day unfortunately betrays Moneypenny for a cheap, lame joke, and the reason I'm zeroing in on this scene rather than Mr. Kill or Yo Mama or Graves' ridiculous Sith RoboCop suit in the climax is because this isn't just bad CGI or a questionable stylistic decision, it's the outright tarnishing of a character who was always an integral part of the series. Luckily, I guess, Die Another Day treats its other characters fairly well, for the most part anyway. There isn't a weak link among the film's trio of villains. Rick Yoon Zhao is a favorite henchman for sure. He's an interesting case as he gets to be the focal point for the first half of the movie, being the guy that Bond is hunting down. For all intents and purposes, Colonel Moon is dead for all of Act 1, and Bond is instead pursuing a goon for about an hour. I don't know if any other Bond film has such a structure where the villain doesn't exist within the story for the first half. Maybe Casino Royale? I don't know. But even that's different. Bond is still directly trying to take down one of Le Chiffre's schemes during that part of the film. Until he sees Zhao in that chamber in the Cuba clinic, Bond's objective is revenge. Anyway, Zhao's great. The diamond-scarred face is a really cool physical deformity. Yoon has a lot of menace and intensity within his performance, and it's nice to see a henchman physically spar with Bond who really gives him a challenge a few times during the movie. The stuff in the clinic maybe turns goofy as the sequence goes on, but I do really like the sort of body horror film vibe that this part of the movie is going for. It ties back into how Tamahori is directing the film differently at each location. I mean, that campy doctor running the clinic who jinx offs is maybe an unnecessary addition to the movie, but he definitely plays as a send-up of Vincent Price, which is wholly appropriate for the overall setting and vibe. Add in the mirror, reflection imagery present in the clinic, evoking the lady from Shanghai, and the sequence kinda overcomes the goofiness with some legitimately cool imagery and action. Shame about the CGI swan dive at the end though. I know. Halle Berry dives off a cliff and the movie dives with her. We've all heard it before. Look, Miranda Frost as a character doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I'll happily concede that. Why does she just go along with North Korea's invasion of the South? The script says she and Moon were friends in school on the fencing team, and Moon rigged the Sydney Olympics so she could win. I guess I can see the path from, oh, you got me a medal, to let me help you orchestrate a war if I squint and maybe also suffer a concussion for good measure. I suppose you could argue that Frost goes along with Moon to help him invade South Korea because of their shared obsession with winning. They're both narcissists after all. That aside, her turn is incredibly obvious. The film can't stop bringing up the man who betrayed Bond, and Frost is the only MI6 character who has substantial screen time in the film who isn't M. Obviously, the mole is Frost. You even get the sense that M in universe doesn't really trust her. Frost, in discussing Bond, describes a man that doesn't seem to line up with who Bond really is. She throws out the typical Bond descriptors: blunt instrument, reckless, shoot first, ask questions later, womanizer. That's the perception of who Bond is, but it isn't who he really is. That isn't the man who only M and a few other people are truly privy to. Perhaps Bond's biggest disguise as a 00 agent is the front he puts up, the act he plays. Bond can be all of those things Frost described, but the man beneath those flaws, his good instincts as a field agent, his loyalty and moral compass, is what keeps him valuable and are the qualities that represent the true James Bond. It's easy for people to overlook that because of a seemingly off-putting persona. I guess the thing is with Bond, what you see is what you get. There's no pretense, there's no hidden agenda. He's very much a straight shooter, regardless of what his detractors may say. The fact that he is incorruptible is part of why people outside of the inner circle don't trust him. Frost's distrust of someone like that, on top of the obvious narrative foreshadowing, is what tips her hand. The other thing that tips her hand is the fact that her record is so squeaky clean. She hasn't shagged, she hasn't uncovered any kind of information on one of the world's most wealthiest eccentric billionaires despite being assigned to him. I mean, her record is so clean that she might as well have not existed at all. Everyone has a past, everyone has flaws. The fact that Frost and Graves are seemingly flawless is bullshit, and you can see M smelling a rat. I don't really know why the film dangles this thread in front of us for so long before bringing the hammer down. It just makes the reveal meaningless by the time it finally comes around. But here's the thing, I recognize these problems with the storytelling, the hollow nature of the character, but I don't care because Rosamund Pike is great in this role. She was like, what, 22 when she filmed this? She took Die Another Day completely seriously despite the unceasing explosion of goofiness around her, and it works perfectly. You've got a dude with diamonds in his face in one side of her, and Toby Stephens all but literally chewing the scenery, though he certainly tries to skewer it with that sword, on the other, and then Rosamund Pike is almost playing the straight man to both of them. Her star exploding after the film was released was more than well deserved, and now she's regarded as one of the best actresses of her generation. And fight against this all you like, but Die Another Day was not only responsible for it, her performance here is terrific in its own right. Yeah, I love Miranda Frost too, even if she doesn't make an ounce of sense on paper. You want to know who the best character in Die Another Day is, though? I'll do you one better. You want to know who the most underrated villain is in the entire series? One of the best? Gustav motherfucking Graves. Toby Stephens is marvelous. He is so camp and so insanely over the top. He's the kind of Bond villain that is just oozing in smarm and, well, villainy on a level that we've only seen a handful of times in the series. It's the cliche Bond villain turned up to 12, and I will never be able to get enough of it. The way Stephens just acts like there's another man beneath his snarly, excessive exterior is honestly fucking incredible. Even the way Rosamund Pike plays opposite him helps increase the atmosphere of this performance. I really don't understand the hate the fan base has for Gustav Graves. I think it's the weird robotic suit, because while that is stupid, everything else about the performance and the character really works for me. He has some genuinely great dramatic scenes, whether it be the sword fight, the unnerving scene in front of the mirror, or the scene with his father on the plane. Funnily enough, Graves gets more of these moments than Bond by the end, despite what the first 20 minutes give Brosnan to do. And I'll praise Will-Yun Lee too. We only get a couple minutes of him in the role, but it lines up really well with Stephens' work later on, and he's a really enjoyable presence. The gene therapy stuff with Graves is dumb, and having Korean villains turn themselves into westernized white guys is a pretty bit iffy now, but it's also in line with the likes of Hugo Drax and his transformation from German to being a proper Englishman, or even Alex Trevelyan burying his true heritage in order to worm his way into a government with whom he has a chip on his shoulder. Obviously, there isn't a racial component in those two cases, so it's more reasonable and far less problematic. That being said, I think the film does frame it as tastefully as it could have, and the actual procedure is described in great detail, and it's portrayed as being painful and grotesque, which seems true to what removing your entire cultural identity would be like, and also helps make it a little less ridiculous by having a substantial amount of difficulty ascribed to it. And when Graves looks at himself in the mirror, there is this sort of horror behind his eyes of what's looking back at him. You get that again when he confronts his father. There is this conceptual body horror. He's looking at his son with an alien face on. There's this idea that he's done something horrific by becoming white. Moon even finds Gustav Graves disgusting and reprehensible. There's this sort of prejudice against Bond and his whiteness. He's become him, and he finds it monstrous. After all, Gustav Graves based his entire alter ego on James Bond, a man he despises, so it just makes sense that he would then find himself equally despicable behind the mask. esque. I really wish the film leaned more into this idea of Graves being, or at least trying to be, a one-to-one counterpart to Bond, because there's a pretty stark contrast between how Bond treats his allies, how he treats pretty much anyone who isn't the villain or goon in his way, versus how Graves treats everyone around him, even the people like Vlad who made his vision possible. And ultimately, when you find out he did all of this just to have his father's approval while missing the lessons his father was trying to teach him, it kind of mirrors how the death of Bond's parents ultimately led him to years later becoming a 00 agent. And of course, Graves commits patricide, the fatal sin that seals his fate. Where Bond is haunted and his heart hardened by the loss of his parents, Graves puts a bullet in his father with barely a tear. Graves' arrogance is the vital contrast between himself and Bond. He loves exercising his intellect over Bond. He relishes in Bond running around in ignorance, unable to put the pieces together about his true identity. However, that arrogance is his undoing. He could have finished Bond off at any moment, but chose not to because it wasn't satisfying enough for him without Bond knowing the truth. He had to milk it for all it's worth. It's the arrogance of knowing, or in this case, thinking he's better than his opponent, perhaps even capable of besting him, only to gloat and embellish his way to defeat like so many Bond villains before him. He can't just win and go home, he has to make a show of it. The difference between Graves' arrogance and Bond's confidence is what ultimately brings Graves down. The pleasure of the kill is in the chase. There it is, Graves' whole motto. He wants to draw it out, feel like there's a challenge even if, in his mind, there isn't one. He's the kind of guy who indulges in the thrill of the hunt because it makes him feel superior, feeds his god complex. Bond will never compromise who he is in order to win or get ahead, whereas Frost and Graves will literally cheat their way into what they want, compromising the very nature of who they are, quite literally when it comes to Graves, in order to win. The thing is though, cheating can only get you so far before it inevitably catches up to you. So you live to die another day, Bond says towards Graves in regards to him cheating death, going to all of these lengths of insanity, but affirming that his fate will remain the same. He can only soar so high before Bond clips his wings and he has to face gravity. Bond won't let someone get away with cheating when he knows damn well his instincts are correct, and even more so, he won't have his instincts questioned when he's given his superiors no reason to. In a sense, Graves is actually the kind of person M accuses Bond of being, or at least who she fears he is. Someone who compromises in the face of difficulty and uncertainty. Someone who will just fall in line with the system and their political agendas in order to eventually get what they want. M has to jump through hoops in order to see justice carried out. It's the only way Bond becomes useful again because he isn't just Her Majesty's loyal terrier. He has a moral code and instincts that allow him to operate outside the jurisdiction of politics, especially since he's been disavowed in this film. It's also funny because knowing who Graves is, it makes sense why he would connect himself to all these wealthy Westerners, politicians, in order to shield himself from any attempt to take him out. He's exploiting the Western bureaucracy for his own gain, like most Musk-esque capitalists, with Graves definitely feels akin to. But while I like a Bond villain who reflects a contemporary commentary, that's not what makes Graves most interesting. Graves, and the other villains in Die Another Day for that matter, aren't just against Bond, they're disgusted by him, which makes them stick out. For as silly as everything is around them, there is something genuinely fascinating about these characters and the disdain they have for James Bond, especially Graves. There's a common adage that the best Bond villains are reflections of Bond in some way. Graves definitely is, which is probably part of why I like him so much. The problem is more that the film doesn't properly focus on this aspect of the character. It pays lip service to it, but the film loses sight of the idea in favor of Graves' plot to invade and capture South Korea, which is just inherently more generic spy stuff and therefore less interesting. The film isn't also helping its plot by centering the scheme to take over South Korea around a ridiculously over-the-top, diamonds are forever-esque space laser that can destroy everything from space, rather than a literally more grounded plan. I say this plot is less interesting than a showdown between Bond and a villain who has literally modeled himself after Bond, and I stand by that relatively speaking, but in its own right, I don't hate the idea of centering a Bond film around the divide between Koreas. It's relevant, it's a little bit of a bleaker story, it has a lot lot of potential for engaging action set pieces, and it's believable that MI6 would get involved given the Western interests in South Korea. Overall, I think the choice to use North Korea as the initial national antagonist was an inspired replacement for Russia post-Berlin Wall. It speaks to the real global superpower threat to Western ideologies of the time. Though, as seems to be a theme with Die Another Day, I feel the storyline would have had even more impact had it been done about a decade later, around the time that Kim Jong-il died and was replaced by his weasel of a son. After all, Colonel Moon is basically a Kim Jong-un stand-in, isn't he? Now, Icarus as this weapon of mass destruction is pretty daft, but in fairness to Purvis and Wade and Tamahori, I do see what they were trying to do with it. The idea of Icarus and therefore Graves and therefore Moon and therefore North Korea being able to bring light and warmth to the darkest parts of the world is really North Korea attempting to spread its brand of Eastern one-party socialism to the West, starting with South Korea, but not necessarily ending there. I like the scene in Iceland where Graves demonstrates Icarus to the attendees, because all the stuff he's saying is kind of evocative of the same ideas that fueled the American dream, which has ballooned into this desire to spread a Western ideology around the world. Icarus demonstrates how destructive that power really is, how it ripped Korea apart, and how it has been tearing apart various other nations. We mostly rail against this now, but in 2002, the consensus, especially thanks to 9/11, was that we should be intervening in places such as the Middle East. Graves is waxing poetic about the shining light of freedom and Western ideology, and then shows what that power really does when imposed onto other parts of the world. It's using warmth versus cold as a metaphor. See, the fire and ice in the title sequence does have a meaning for Graves' ambitions towards North Korean dominance over the West. I also think painting the North Koreans as a less caricaturistic version of military leaders, especially compared to, say, the Russians and Octopussy, is really smart. It humanizes them and actually makes the antagonists feel more threatening. It ties into the parallels between Moon, Graves, and Bond, too. Both are arms of their respective governments who play by their own rules, regardless of whether or not it's what their superiors want them to do. I think it's also interesting how Bond's superior is akin to his mother and Moon's superior is literally his father. And while it's above my station and not my lived experience, there also seems to be an angle in Moon's characterization about Asian sons and disapproving fathers that really drives Moon's arc the entire film. It's prescient of how Jong-un has become a much worse version of his father in trying to live up to him, but I also think what the film is trying to say with Moon transforming himself into a white man, that he would channel that into the resources needed to achieve his goals as a Korean, is actually kinda clever and beat Tropic Thunder to the punch by about 5 or 6 years, even if the racial commentary in that film is admittedly way more intelligent. So much of Die Another Day is about the Western veneer and how it is used to get ahead even if it's exploiting other people and cultures, as Graves is sort of doing. Graves discovered diamonds in Iceland a year or so ago and has been profiting off of them, yet they're identical to conflict diamonds. It's, in other words, the same shit repackaged with a nice, shiny, white, westernized veneer. Moon/Graves majored in Western hypocrisy, of course, and while that line is a joke, he certainly used what he learned in university to his advantage, gaming the system to become one of the wealthiest Brits in England. There is this overall sort of disgust of turning your back on who you truly are, being ashamed of your roots or your nationality in favor of something deemed more acceptable or desirable. The villains may think they're making a point, outwardly assimilating towards the West and rejecting their culture while internally exploiting Western culture, but the truth is, by doing that, they're no better than the colonizers. By self-erasing their culture, their heritage, they're letting them win. Also, can we just talk for a moment about the magnificent Kenneth Song, who died recently, and his performance as General Moon? I mean, this is a character whose screen time barely amounts to supporting, but it's some of the best, most compelling stuff in the film. I'd actually go so far as to say it's the best performance in the entire movie. It feels real and soulful and sorrowful at the same time. His verbal sparring with Bond in the interrogation room is fantastic, and later on, the way he emotionally navigates first his realization that his son is alive, followed by his horror at what that same son has become, is way more resonant than it had any right being, or than it really needed to be. And you think Rosamund Pike took this film seriously? It's like no one told Song he was making the most ridiculous Bond film to date. He is committed to his part despite its brevity. There's a lot of great stuff with him questioning Bond's unwavering dedication to the mission even after his government abandoned him. It's the age-old question of why does Bond do what he does? Why does he work for a nation that seems to care only about his results and not at all about him? I also like to think that General Moon, given his age, was involved in the Korean War, as it, and the ensuing political clusterfuck in the decades since, seemed to weigh heavily on his mind. I also find it interesting how General Moon very loudly distances himself from the extremists who think there can be no other solution to the Korean conflict other than a North Korean annexation of South Korea. I don't condone what they do here, he says, about the torture inflicted on Bond as a prisoner. He doesn't condone that or the extremism, but he doesn't act against any of it either. It's fascinating, and again, this is something I would have welcomed more focus on in the actual film. Honestly, the stuff with General Moon not wanting to believe that his son is just a bad person is pretty spot on. Traditional parents, not even just Asian ones specifically, though that's certainly been the portrayed experience in a lot of media, most namely recently Everything Everywhere All at Once, have a difficult time accepting that their children could be capable of straying so far from the path they predetermined for them. It has to be someone else that made Moon betray his country and people, not necessarily that General Moon pushed him away or anything. Die Another Day is just such a refreshing look at the East versus West conflict and how the West just comes in, wreaks havoc, and then leaves the broken nation to just pick up the pieces. It maybe could have leaned into it more, but I really enjoy what the film has to say, even in some of the smaller moments. Remember that club employee from earlier, after Bond and Graves' duel made a mess of the place? Place needed redecorating anyway. I love how he sees the amusement and the sheer stupidity in the old ways of the West. Die Another Day does a great job early on of establishing the state of Korea, lending a bit of empathy to General Moon for wanting to avenge his son, for loving him, and also for loving his country and his people. They paint him as less of a straightforward, nefarious fascist and more as a guy who just wants his broken country to be mended again. Korea, just like his heart, will never be whole again. He's probably not a great guy, but I do like how the film is less judgmental of him and his actions, instead more so trying to understand why someone like him behaves the way they do, and makes the decisions and commitments they do. It actually makes General Moon a very tragic character, and the performance only drives this home and really enriches the commentary of Die Another Day on a level that few other Bond films ever have. Okay, but this is a Bond film. So how does it treat Bond? Well, we're gonna talk about James Bond, but I'd really like to talk about Jinx as well. Okay, listen, I know, okay? Can we just get through this? All right, come on. Jinx and Bond's interactions are, well, just a battle of innuendos. Whenever they're together on screen, these aren't really characters. They're more caricatures of people exchanging dialogue in a movie. It's those 80s screenplay vibes poking their head all the way out. Tamahori modeled Jinx after this swingin' 60s female spy protagonist, Majesty Blaze, who dressed exactly like Jinx in a skin-tight catsuit. I think both of those elements are readily, nay loudly apparent in her characterization as well. She and Bond don't even have to talk like two normal people. They can speak in code, in riddles, and understand each other because they're practically the same. And to be fair, I do like how Jinx is as sexual as Bond. She has the same mentality of, sex is fun and I can use it to my advantage, so fuck all, why not? It's a great dynamic. I think it just suffers from a consistent problem Die Another Day has, which is, yeah, they acknowledge that it exists, but they don't really utilize it much beyond that. I think the movie actually should have had her engage with more potential partners. It was a nice role reversal to have Bond wake up and she's ditched him, and reversal on how Bond often treats women, and also a your move kind of statement. As for the rest, yeah, okay, Halle Berry isn't directed very well in this movie. It's a stunningly bad performance, and given her track record, I find it very difficult to believe she just suddenly forgot how to act. The woman came in to Die Another Day fresh off having won a wholly deserved Oscar. Come on, not to mention the dialogue she had to work with. There is no actress who could have made Yo Mama work. To top it off, the character is a thin rehash of things done better with the likes of Holly Goodhead and Pam Bovier, and yeah, look, I'm not gonna mount some giant Jinx defense, okay? God knows you'd all just throw me off an even taller cliff than the one she dives off of. Let's get down to business. Here's something I will defend: Pierce Brosnan, and specifically Pierce Brosnan in this film. Even among most of the people who do rightly love him as James Bond, I often see Die Another Day regarded as his weakest performance. Now, for my money, the gap between his best and worst is probably the thinnest of any of the Bond actors, at least in my books, so I don't know if I could even say whether or not Die Another Day is his best performance, weakest, or something else. By the way, his best performance is in Tomorrow Never Dies, and that's a fact. I do know that I really love his performance in Die Another Day, though. The only thing that holds Pierce's performance back is the fact that he's hardly fed any actual dialogue. When he's just tossing bad innuendos nonstop, it's not so great. But when he does have actual lines, threw it away years ago, So You Live to Die Another Day, he really makes it work. It's all delivered with so much conviction. Also, Die Another Day features one of the best martini orders in the entire series.
Vodka martini. Plenty of ice, if you can spare it.
That line being uttered in a literal ice palace is just so goddamn Ian Fleming, even if the setting itself is a bit too ridiculous for Fleming. Brosnan is doing really strong work all around, particularly in Everything Before Cuba, and I think the scene where he resuscitates Jinx deserves plaudits as well, but probably the biggest strength of the film as far as Bond himself is concerned are his scenes opposite Judi Dench. Her M and Brosnan's Bond always had great chemistry together, but this film feels like everything they were going for, particularly in GoldenEye with her initial takedown of him, and in The World Is Not Enough with her openness towards him, brought to a head. In fact, while the Craig era would definitely represent a more defined arc for Bond, I do still think there is something of a progression from who Bond is in GoldenEye to who he is in Die Another Day, and I think you can directly map that progression in just the scenes he shares with M. His relationship grows from hostile with M in GoldenEye to one of deep respect in Tomorrow Never Dies to a fairly close one in The World Is Not Enough to the complicated what are we doing here dynamic they have in Die Another Day. The best scene is when they meet inside an abandoned station for abandoned agents. They really get to just lay all their cards on the table, both as actors and as characters, and as much as Brosnan might not have been aware that this would be his final James Bond performance, to say that this is the last time his Bond and Dench's M share the screen, the scene has the energy of, well, this is our last chance to show this relationship, let's just put it all out there. I think Bond feels scorned by M in a sense. Her compassion for him caused the prisoner swap to happen, and Bond was almost tortured to death for nothing since Zhao was returned to the Koreans anyway. She claims Bond's value as the main reason, but we know deep down it's because she cares for him. Bond's frustrated though because he'd rather die than allow even one life to be jeopardized by the prisoner swap. In a way, him dying as a prisoner also gives his life some purpose. Knowing that MI6 has Zhao, who will give them what they need, is the kind of thing that in Bond's eyes justifies his own suffering. He's completed the mission, even if it means he can't walk away with his life, and you get the sense he's made peace with that before it all goes tits up upon his release. It almost speaks to Bond's desire to die on the job, to almost give himself the rest he so desperately craves, given he's a company man who kind of just hates his job. It's not that Bond wants or needs to be a martyr, but rather he wants his sacrifice, his work, the carnage he causes to have meaning. Which is why I think you see him with such strength and resolve when he goes rogue. He's not even given the satisfaction of death in Korea because he needs to survive in order to save the world. Because no one else can do what he does, the way he does it, which is what makes him the best of the best.
Been busy, have we, Mr. Bond?
Just surviving, Mr. Chang.
I know that's really just a quick joke between Bond and a familiar hotel manager, but it speaks to what's happening with him. He's not necessarily living, he's surviving because it's instinctive. It's also in line with what Natalia says to him in GoldenEye about him killing people and it taking a toll on him, where Bond retorts with, "It's what keeps me alive." He's constantly thinking about the next survival move or the next move necessary in order to complete the mission and save the world. It's never about what Bond wants personally or how he wants to live. Paradoxically though, Bond really doesn't have much else going for him in his life outside of his occupation. It's almost why he takes personal offense to M talking down to him for failing the mission, challenging him on his loyalty and strength, insinuating he cracked. If Bond's the perfect soldier, he can't possibly fail, which is why it's also interesting how Graves chooses to model himself off of him. It's almost a retort to how disgusting the Western ideology of status, success, and occupation is. There are further parallels between Bond and Graves in this respect. Bond in Die Another Day is like the kid who was loved too much by his parents and suffocated to a point where he can't make his own choices, whereas Moon or Graves is the kid who longs for the outward love and approval of his parent. Bond is also really pissed at M for not trusting him to finish the job and abandoning him after the swap. I think M assumed Bond would escape, but it's easy to see why Bond would be frustrated with her leaving him like that, with the outward lack of trust after years of service. Bond values loyalty, and when people disrespect that loyalty, he gets pissed. M protests that she can't afford to see the world as black and white as he does, that she'll do whatever it takes to get the job done, even if that means compromising. She claims that she's just like Bond in that respect, but the difference is Bond will get the job done without compromising himself or the mission. That's the confidence he has, and while she may view it as arrogance, he's never really done anything to prove her wrong, which is part of why he feels so scorned in this moment. Yes, sometimes tough calls need to be made, and the business of espionage is not one which relies on trustworthiness, but that's also why someone like James Bond is so valuable. You can rely on him. You can trust that he will live to die another day in order to get the job done. M might not have seen that at first, but she definitely does now. James Bond is not irrelevant. But you can see how this idea of irrelevance only further invigorates Bond. It motivates him to clear his name and put his skills to the test to not only uncover the truth, but prove he's still needed, that the agency still has use for him. He isn't as old and washed up as M would believe him to be, which harkens back to how he once viewed her as a bean counter and she viewed him as a sexist, misogynist dinosaur. These two colleagues who have developed a mutual respect, even if they don't necessarily see eye to eye, are once again at odds when it comes to whether or not Bond can get the job done. But sometimes M speaks in code, and her words carry a different meaning. What this scene in the abandoned station reveals is that it was all about challenging Bond in order for him to do what is necessary to finish the job, because ultimately, she does believe he can do it, unlike the Americans who are so arrogant that they can't put their trust in anyone but themselves to finish the job. They have to micromanage. Now look, I'm not trying to say that this is a masterclass in screenwriting and that you're an idiot if this scene or anything else in Die Another Day went over your head. It's still fucking Die Another Day. The dialogue is often clunky, and the film is defined more by raising interesting ideas for character and story, but not actually following through on exploring them. But does any of this stuff seem familiar to you? The Craig era did a lot of it better and more effectively, particularly in Skyfall and No Time to Die. They more compellingly interrogated and then reaffirmed Bond's ability as a good agent and how that makes him invaluable. He isn't politically motivated. He doesn't have to jump through hoops. You can definitely plot a course from here to the end of the Craig era and the ideas Purvis and Wade were more interested in exploring, which we've also touched on before in our videos on Casino Royale, Quantum of Solace, and No Time to Die. Die Another Day is almost a film about Bond compensating and trying to prove he's the best agent, prove himself to his superiors, and outsmart the enemy. It's almost a game of wits, which kind of explains, 80s action film vibes aside, why so much of the film is written in entendres. Bond is trying to outwit everyone else, and they're giving him a good fight in return. And it's really just funny to me how much of this can be seen echoed in the Craig era. Casino Royale is generally described as a complete reset, an absolute course correction from Die Another Day. And on the one hand, yeah, it definitely is. The ridiculous goofiness, the unnatural dialogue, the nonsensically over-the-top set pieces. Those were all shed between the two films and two eras. But I also think it's a description made from an incomplete, imperfect picture. We can laugh at Die Another Day for being the stupid Bond film and wax lyrical about how thankful we are that Eon left it in a dumpster where it belongs or whatever. But my ultimate takeaway is that despite its reputation, Die Another Day has a much larger foothold on what has come since than is immediately apparent, and I think that's easiest to see when you look at the utilization within the film itself of Bond as a character. Whew! Alright, well, if you made it this far, thank you. You have my undying gratitude, but also, God, get a fucking life. No, I'm just kidding. Thank you so much. Please, seriously, don't leave. Watch the rest, hear me out, please. So Die Another Day, huh? The king of speed ramps and the ice palace at the center of the land of absurdity. This film really does stretch the credulity of the Bond formula at times. Yeah, there's a lot that the film is trying to say, and Brosnan is saying it well, but I think the film itself lost the delivery during the edit, and you're ultimately ultimately left with ideas that suggest a much better film, but which ultimately were just done better during the Craig era. This movie is bad. I mean, it's not a good movie. Like, again, the characters aren't even speaking words. They're not saying things. They're just speaking in entendres. Like, seriously, watch the Jinx and James Bond first encounter scene. They're saying nothing. They aren't saying, like, they're not speaking things to people. Jesus. The invisible car chase is also goddamn absurd, but it's honestly so much fun. It's another thing that got lost in the edit. The speed ramps, the over-stylization ruins what is otherwise exhilarating stunt work. Even the finale of the film is ripping off much better films. It's so clear they wanted John Woo for the climactic fight scenes, essentially an inferior version of what he would do in something like MI2, Face Off, even Hard Boiled. And you know what? I wouldn't trade Time to Face Destiny, Time to Face Gravity for anything. God love him. Pierce's commitment to selling the moment is what makes so many of what would otherwise be the most ridiculed moments of his tenure not only palatable, but often entertaining in a good way. When Tamahori, Purvis and Wade, Brosnan, Eon set out to make Die Another Day, they were actively trying so hard to not make Moonraker, but they ended up so deep into that territory that they wound up doing something far sillier, and that's really saying something because Moonraker has Bond ride a gondola through Venice while a dog looks on in bewilderment and a pigeon does a fucking double take. And it's also the movie that launched James Bond into space. It's far more grounded than most anything in Die Another Day. When the film released, Roger Moore did a review of Die Another Day, and it basically boiled down to, yeah, I'm the Bond who went to space, but fucking hell, ladies and gentlemen. Moore absolutely shredded the movie, which is just kind of funny to me and a great little piece of Bond history. So is Die Another Day the worst Bond film, or at least one of the worst? I mean, yeah, I have to at least lean towards the latter, though I think Diamonds Are Forever is incapable of vacating its spot at the bottom for me, and The Man with the Golden Gun is just an unpleasant viewing experience. I'll say this, I have my preferences, and I definitely lean more towards a hard-edged spy caper than an outlandish story for Bond, but there's something to gain out of all of them. The fun of the franchise is there's a multitude of different Bond stories ranging across genres, tones, performance styles. I sincerely believe there is at least one Bond film for everyone. Die Another Day probably wouldn't have the best results if you were to ask 100 random Bond fans whether or not they consider it one that they eagerly put on as a Saturday afternoon Bond viewing, and yeah, maybe that's fair. But I also respect the fact that Lee Tamahori wanted to try something different and went for it, and Barbara and Michael backed him. They stood by their filmmaker, and that's what matters. The Bond film's death knell won't be sounded by Die Another Day. It'll come when filmmakers are no longer permitted to make their Bond film. So as long as the vision behind filmmaking continues to be respected by the shepherds of this franchise, I can live with the occasional Die Another Day, because I'll at least know that the next Casino Royale is just around the corner.